What does it take to win an NBA championship?
They've done it! They win their first championship in franchise history!
Welcome to Building a Champion, a new podcast that takes an in-depth, inside look at what it takes to make it to the finals. Hosted by two-time NBA champion Dave Wohl, Building a Champion goes off the court and into the front office, talking with some of the biggest names in basketball. Exclusive interviews with the players, coaches, GMs, and scouts who took their teams all the way to the NBA championships and won. And now, here's your host for Building a Champion, Dave Wohl.
Welcome to Building a Champion podcast. I'm Dave Wohl, your host, and my guest this morning is Darrel Morey, the GM of the Houston Rockets, who is obsessed with dethroning Golden State. Thanks for taking the time to join us today, Darrel.
Thanks, Dave. Appreciate it. I am obsessed with I'm obsessed with winning the title, which will probably require dethroning Golden State. So,
well, what I love is you're one of the few GMs that's come out publicly and said that is your obsession. The other ones are saying it behind closed doors, in the privacy of their offices. But I love that you came out front and said, hey, this is what we're going after. Darrel, one of the things you've been credited, and I've known you for a while, with bringing analytics to the forefront in many areas of NBA front office decision-making, and the use of analytics has dramatically changed the style of play in the NBA. We now have evolved to more three-point shots and layups because of their higher value than two-point shots. A new position has been invented called stretch fours and stretch fives, where we have the once low-post Brooks Lopez's of the world never getting closer to the basket than the three-point line. We're playing small ball lineups, analytical models for the draft, trades, and free agencies, real plus minus, and other metrics. Did you see this coming when you first came in and you started to use analytics in the ways you've used it?
Well, yeah, for sure. I saw it coming, but someone else did, which was you. So I don't know if your listeners know that my first NBA job was working with Dave, and I was sort of the guy who was annoying folks at the practice facility when I first got there, as you know, and you had a pretty interesting formula. We have all these more advanced things with overhead cameras and tracking the players, but you had a formula that honestly, and I think you've talked to Mike Zarin and others, gets it pretty close in terms of like just having a simple way of evaluating players.
Yeah, it was kind of production per minute and everything. And I think, a lot smarter people have taken things a lot further than I have. Now, do you see the metrics now? Because it seems like almost every year somebody comes up with some new metric to try and measure performance or something. Do you see that continuing, or do you think there's kind of like a plateau we've hit where there's enough out there that give everybody the information they sort of need to inform themselves of decision making?
It'll continue because there's really no one way of looking at a player, as you know too well, since I think you're still the only guy who's held every job in the NBA: player, head coach, GM, CEO. I mean. So again, I don't know if your listeners know how unique of a podcast host I'm talking to, but you can't look at a player from one dimension. So there are constantly different dimensions being created, i.e. the gravity of a player, how much they draw the defense to them, whether it's, like you mentioned, real plus minus, which are these all-in-one metrics, which try to encompass how many wins a player generates, during the possessions they're on the floor. It's a very hard game to boil down. It's a great combination of science and art. A stretch four, for example, if you're the only stretch four on a team, you might have a huge win impact for your team in that you're spacing the floor and creating driving lanes for your teammates. So a formula might say, hey, you have a big impact based on how much you can space the floor and threaten the defense, or how far away you can shoot. But the reality is, you might be able to fill that role with multiple players, or have position switchers, guys who are threes who can play four, guys who are fours who can play five. So it's a very dynamic game. And anytime we find that we feel like we're figuring the game out, it shifts, and the coaches make some really interesting strategic shifts, and you got to go back and refine, the analytics you're using to evaluate players.
You know, everybody thinks because analytics is kind of tied to you, that every deal you make or every draft you make is totally influenced just by your analytical models. Where does the visual scouting and the intel gathering fit, and how do you integrate the two into your decision making?
Yeah, it's big, and Michael Lewis had the book on Doing Project, which covered some of this. If people wanna dive into it more, but the reality is, to your point, we have a great scouting staff led by Gerson Rosas. We have a great group that does background on players, and again, you're trying to get a 360-degree view of a player. What are their habits? What are their physical tools? What has their production been to date? What are their psychological drivers? All these things develop a picture of a player, and the NBA is provably pretty bad at figuring out who's going to be good out of college. I wish I could say we're amazing at it. We're good at it, but we're not great at it. It's basically provably 70% error and 30% is how well the best teams do, and we have just like a 3 to 5% edge on the other teams right now, which is probably unfortunately eroding as other teams get smarter.
Well, I thought that one of the things that I think was Michael Lewis's article was on Joey Dorsey, that you were really excited when you drafted him, and then you realized that you had to make an adjustment to like the filters in the model. If you could take a minute or so and kind of explain what you learned from that.
Yeah, for sure. So, we were looking at a lot of different factors back then, but one of the things was, rebounders and defenders. This is not news to anyone who's watched basketball, but, guys who could protect the paint, rebound at a high level, were ones that had a big impact in an area that we felt like was a need. And the choice came down to Joey Dorsey or DeAndre Jordan. And Joey Dorsey was this guy who literally, won the national title, was doing exactly what we needed. He was in his mid-20s when he came out of college. And then on the flip side, you had a DeAndre Jordan, 7-footer, athletic, obviously has gone on to be a great player that people are familiar with. But he did basically nothing in college. We had that choice and, went with Joey Dorsey.
One of the things that I think listeners or fans think is that analytics really only applies to players. But one of the things I thought you did really well in the team you have now is you picked Mike D'Antoni as your coach. And I thought this was a perfect marriage of your philosophy of, space the floor, more threes and things like that, and the style that Mike coaches. Did that come into your decision making with him?
1,000,000%. Coach D'Antoni was someone we always thought was a great fit and an innovator, as people know, a longtime innovator, both in Europe as a coach and then in the NBA as a coach with the Suns. And every time we had a coach opening, he unfortunately was, or for him good, but for us bad, he was gainfully employed. So we never really had the opportunity to even interview him. When we had our last opening, we were lucky that he was available. I interviewed him, and it was really like, it was almost like a Vulcan mind meld. Like he's so innovative and forward thinking. He was exactly what we were hoping for, and we also got the benefit of, as you know, I think coaches generally just get better over time, right? Because they're picking something up from the players, the people around them, and Mike had 2 tough stops in New York and LA. But when we looked at them, a lot of it was just the players weren't really fitting the style of play. And so we felt like it was just a great fit for how we play and how he wants to play. And that we thought we could deliver the players that would help, he would make the players better, and hopefully we'd be able to find the players that would fit his system well.
Be sure to check out more Building a Champion podcast episodes where Dave talks with NBA greats like Jerry West.
It was enough, and this gigantic person filled the door of Shaquille O'Neal.
Head coach Doc Rivers.
I asked each player for $100. I grabbed the money and I put it up in the ceiling.
Former GM of the Cavaliers, David Griffin.
I got there in September and LeBron had left in July, and it was like jumping in a burning building.
And many more will give you the inside story and what it takes to win the NBA Finals.
I remember our first exhibition game and said, we're really good. We're championship good.
We'll be back with more Building a Champion after this short break.
Welcome to another edition of Game Changers, a look at the pivotal events and decisions that changed the game of basketball to what it is today. Brought to you by the Building a Champion podcast. Today's game changer, the three-pointer.
4 to shoot. Harden shake and bake. Steps back. Three-pointer. Bang!
No matter what you call it, three, tray, triple, downtown, behind the arc, the three-point shot has changed the NBA game dramatically since it was first introduced in 1979. Because of the three-pointer, the dominant center is a thing of the past. Today's teams are smaller and quicker, with centers hanging out behind the arc as much as they are in the paint. The stretch 3 and stretch 4 positions are cornerstones on every team. A 2-point lead is no longer a 2-possession game in the waning seconds. Imagine what the stats of jump shot specialists like John Havlicek, Rick Barry, and Jerry West would look like if they could have chalked up 3 points on a shot behind the arc instead of just 2. And while we're at it, imagine what downtown specialists like Steph Curry, James Harden, and Paul George's stats would look like without the three-pointer.
A 3 wins the series. He got the shot off. Oh my God! And the Blazers win the series.
It's 23 feet 9 inches from the basket at the top of the arc and 22 feet in the corners. But the game is light years away from where it was before the three-point line was drawn.
And now, back to Building a Champion.
You're listening to Building a Champion podcast. I'm Dave Wohl, your host, and my guest today is Darrel Morey, the general manager of the Houston Rockets. I want to move to the first pivotal move for your team, which is the James Harden trade. And one question would be, had you been talking with OKC about Harden, or did this call just come out of the blue?
Well, to set the stage a little bit, when Yao Ming and Tracy McGrady, we had our best run in 2009 with them and made it to the second round of the playoffs and took the Lakers to 7 games. But then after that year, both Yao Ming and Tracy McGrady basically never played in the NBA again. They had a couple games, but they were injured. And so we were in a rebuilding phase, and we were chasing every top player. And I think, Dave, you know this better than anybody. You really don't have a chance of the title unless you have at least one elite player, and usually you need 2, and maybe even preferably 3, although
right.
That's often hard to put together. Though you had your Celtics championship team had quite a few top players, so that was pretty good. But yeah, so we knew we had to get that cornerstone star, and any time a player who is young looked like they could develop into a cornerstone player, and we weren't even sure James would be that. We thought James for sure was on his path to be an all-star, but to go on to be, arguably the best player in the league was not something we were counting on when we made the deal. But we were chasing all the top players at the time, and James for sure looked like someone who could develop into that. So from the moment he was drafted with Oklahoma City, we were sort of harassing Oklahoma City about, hey, is there a chance for us to trade for him, and not being shy that we'll pretty much, give him anything that's not bolted down on our roster, because it could be a win-win because he was coming off the bench. We had a lot of really good role players that we thought could fit what they wanted to do. And we knew that they also wanted future assets. So we made the tough decision to trade Lowry for a first-round pick, but that ended up being the key asset in the trade. So it was a long time harassment. So, stalking sometimes works is what I would say. We just stalked OKC until, we were able to get a deal done in his 3rd year.
Now, a lot of fans see, they see movies where there's a draft, like the movie Draft Day comes out, and they think negotiations actually work where you and Sam spend a minute on the phone and then one of you yells, "Deal." So did that happen? I mean, that's what happened really for this one, right?
and you have to fly to the city to do a deal. That was in Moneyball or whatever.
Yeah.
As you know, Dave, the deals that usually get done have been talked about for a long time, where teams, really talk about the interest in each other's players. And then usually a deadline or maybe an injury or something will trigger, or the draft coming up, something will trigger a team saying, okay, let's see if we can push this over the finish line. And usually that team ends up giving up a little more to get the deal done. And then that's and then it's usually a bunch of phone calls. But I mean, it's like we had the parameters of the deal for James Harden done for almost a month and a half, with some minor pieces to be worked out. But it didn't like maybe mid-September, but it didn't happen until October, end of October, when James turned down the extension they were offering him. That was the catalyst for them to do the deal with us.
Right. Well, you mentioned having to get 2 franchise players, and I think the other question now is, or the example is, great cap management in building a championship is the Chris Paul trade. Who I was with the Clippers at the time, and I thought this was a fascinating trade because Chris was due to be a free agent, met with the Clippers and said he really wanted to sign with Houston, and instead of waiting for him to be a free agent, you wanted to do the deal before the free agency started, because you would end up with Chris's rights and he would have to opt into his contract. But then if you had tried to wait and sign him as a free agent, you would have had to carve out the salary slot for him, which is often a lot harder to do.
Right. Yeah, we would have had to trade Eric Gordon to get it done. Was one of the big things that we probably were going to have to do. There's a few things we had to do, but it would have been very painful, and our team would have been a lot worse. And we wanted our team, as you know, to be as good as possible, because obviously Chris is in his prime, and so is James. We wanted to capitalize on that. So, but yeah, no, we were willing to give up more, and unfortunately we had to give up a lot of very good players who are helping the Clippers now to get the deal done early, because it allowed us to keep an Eric Gordon and go out and get a PJ Tucker, and keep Ryan Anderson, who we then were able to turn into Shumpert, who's been an important role player for us since we got him at the deadline this year. So it's, as you know, it's all like tied together in the NBA. Like it's very rarely like I'm trading my small forward for your small forward. It's usually every sort of move has to work in concert, almost like a puzzle you're putting together.
Well, I thought one of the things people probably didn't realize that you were having to do too is you were having to do some other side deals with like minimum guys that might have had a guarantee to get non-guaranteed contracts to be able to fit into the overall salary regulations. And, that's not easy to do when you're trying, when you're trying to do it like in a day or two. And I thought you did a fantastic job. And fans don't see that. They just see the final trade and they go, oh, okay, they just traded those guys for those guys, but they don't see some of the mechanics that had to go behind that to fit into the salary restrictions, And this is one of those trades. Go ahead.
We have some great cap guys, as I know you've worked with a bunch of great ones, but Eli Whitus, Monty, Sachin Gupta, Rafael. Yeah, we had to buy some players and plug them into our cap room prior to doing the trade, such that then we could then retrade them to add talent after. So yeah, that was the whole sort of the details on the Chris trade, as you know. And people think it's all milk and honey in the NBA, and it is. They are great. That Chris Paul trade, I think, finished at 5 a.m. Central Time, 3 a.m. Pacific Time that night. And I remember talking to you that night a couple times, and pretty much the staff on both sides, everyone was there until that time, which was pretty crazy. But
it's a great example of a trade that really works out for both teams. You get Chris, which you really wanted to pair with James, and the Clippers really end up with Lou Williams, Patrick Beverley, Montrezl Harrell, and the first round pick we got allowed them to do a secondary deal and get Gallinari from Denver. And those are 4 guys who were playing terrific for the Clippers. And one of the things I know Lawrence and I talked about back then is trying to see people tended not to do things in sign-in trades or, to see if they could get some quality. So those were always things we tried to think about. What can you get in those instances rather than just lose a player, for anything. And that one I thought was a great example.
That was one of the all-time great win-win trades, really, because the Clippers are really well positioned for the future, and we were obviously focused on getting as good a team to knock off Golden State right away. And I think if Chris doesn't hurt his hamstring, I think I would have been calling you about how to make a ring, since you know how to do it. So,
well, hopefully you've got one. You'll be calling me again in the near future to do that. I have to tell you, I'm going to give you one fact, Darrel, that you may not even know as we close on this podcast is everybody worries about around the trade deadline because of your willingness to make trades. And you are the king of 3 or 4 team trades. That involves 3 or 4 teams. In your time at Houston, you've made 11 trades that have involved 3 or 4 teams involving 74 players. So
wow, no, I did not know.
Yeah,
That's crazy.
So you're in the record books on that one when I did a little research on things, and so teams probably it's right for them to get a little nervous around those trade times. You're listening.
They should not be nervous. They should be thinking about how we can all help each other. So.
Yeah, win-win trades that you're doing all the time.
Exactly.
Yeah. You're listening to Building a Champion podcast. I'm Dave Wohl, your host. Darrel, thanks so much for spending some time with me today, and good luck in the playoffs.
Thanks for having me on, Dave. I appreciate it.